We'll also turn to Lord's Day 4 in the Heidelberg Catechism, which is where we are this afternoon in the Heidelberg Catechism. It's Lord's Day 4, page 520 of your book of praise, if you have one with you. Lord's Day 4, which says, "But does not God do man an injustice by requiring in his law what man cannot do? No. For God so created man that he was able to do it. But man, at the instigation of the devil, in deliberate disobedience, robbed himself and all his descendants of these gifts. Will God allow such disobedience and apostasy to go unpunished? Certainly not. He is terribly angry with our original sin as well as our actual sins. Therefore he will punish them by a just judgment, both now and eternally, as he has declared, 'Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them.' But is God not also merciful? God is indeed merciful, but he is also just. His justice requires that sin committed against the most high majesty of God also be punished with the most severe, that is, with everlasting punishment of body and soul." That's for the reading of the Catechism. Brothers and sisters, of course, this afternoon we continue our afternoon teaching series on the Heidelberg Catechism. Those of you who may not be familiar with our practice here in the afternoon worship service, we always go through the Heidelberg Catechism, which is a summary of the truths explained in Scripture. We started on Lord's Day 1, which we saw that Jesus Christ is our only comfort, our only salvation in a world of death. The Christian's identity is to be a servant of Christ, a slave of Christ. Lord's Days 2 and 3, we learned about our sin and misery. We saw that sin is revealed by God through the law. We saw that sin entered the world through man's sin and disobedience. And now we see that man is totally depraved unless the Holy Spirit fills his heart, in which case he can do good again. Now we're on Lord's Day 4. If you read through Lord's Day 4, you'll begin to realize that Lord's Day 4 is all about the question of justice. If you read question and answer 9, the question prefaces the point, "But does not God do man an injustice by requiring in his law what man cannot do?" The question, you can see, is asking, is God unjust? In other words, I think God may be unjust because he doesn't have the same justice that I think is the right kind of justice. You can really hear the ego of sinful man in this question. You know what? I know what's truly just. God should conform to my idea of justice. Isn't he unjust by this, X? Now I'm going to continue on this, but first I want to back up a little bit. What is justice anyways? In the English language, especially in our Western culture, justice is closely associated with the idea of fairness. What is right? What are the correct punishments or consequences for those who do wrong? That's why we have the scales of justice in our courtrooms. And justice is about what's fair, really. Now in the Bible, justice is a little bit more to justice than that. In the Bible, justice is tied to the concept of righteousness. The concept of righteousness very much has to do with if man is created as a human being, how is he righteous? How does he do his position in society rightly before God? And the same would be, how does an animal be just? An animal is just by behaving well as an animal in God's kingdom. And so it's more positional, and it has everything to do with its relationship to God. Abraham is declared righteous because he's in right relationship to God. And it's unjust for man to not be righteous by choosing sin. That's more how justice functions in the Bible. But let me back up again a little bit again. Even if you came into this building today and you're not a Christian and you don't believe in the Bible, you don't any of these things, the question of justice is still inescapable. Every person has ideas of justice in their head. It's fundamental to what it means to be human. And the ideas that you hold on justice have massive implications for what you do and think and behave in life. Maybe tomorrow is a good exercise for you. Take all the conversations that you have in your house tomorrow on Monday and look at how many of them, what percentage of them is about fairness. I suspect, let's maybe think about yesterday on Saturday, all the conversations we had on Saturday. A significant number of them involved the concept of fairness. Any political conversation, fairness is at the center. Any religious conversation, justice, it's always there. And our culture has ideas on justice. And there are a few of them that I want to just identify quickly, just to give you context on the biblical view. First of all, there are many of those in our culture that would say that there is no justice. The concept is not really valid. And what's really being said is that, well, maybe there is justice, but it's culturally defined. Each person has their own truth, their own sense of fairness and right and wrong, or each culture has a separate one, and that's fine, which effectively is to say there's no objective justice. It's relativism. Each person has their own truth. Now, that's some people. I think in university I met a few people like that had basically believed in that. I think a lot of Canadians have some view of this. There's also those who do believe in justice, but they believe in social justice. And essentially, and I want to try to be fair here, to me it seems that what that is a view of where justice is essentially economic or on a wealth level or material. So justice is all about fairness in wealth, fairness in opportunities, fairness in your status and culture. And the purpose of social justice is to equalize things so that each person has either the same income or income level, or perhaps the same opportunities, or even the same outcomes, so to speak. And I think one of the reasons social justice is such a big deal in our culture is because we've largely stopped thinking of justice in terms of morality and objective moral standards of right and wrong. And so social justice has kind of filled that vacuum. And now politics is about social justice, and that's the endless conversation. Now, third, there are those who have jumped from social justice to a new thing called wokeness, essentially. And in that sense, and in wokeness, justice is about eradicating racism and discrimination, oppression. And the job of justice and courts and governments is to eliminate these things and to redesign society so that these things can't exist. Again, all underneath all of these things is a redefinition of what justice actually is. What is fundamentally fair and just is the great question. Now, the problem with a lot of our culture's redefinitions of justice is that by redefining justice, they create injustice by definition. So my favorite people, for example, are those who are culturally relativistic. If you meet someone who says, well, I don't really believe you have your truth and I have my truth, the first thing you could do is steal their wallet. It's kind of funny, but really, if my truth is my truth and your truth is your truth, well, my truth is that I should have your wallet. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. And honestly, in my worldview, perhaps stealing from relativists is an honorable thing because that would teach them that their philosophy is not good. See, you can get here very quickly. The problem with social justice is that in order to make a culture in which everyone has the same level of wealth or everyone has the same outcomes. See, this is communism, right? It's Marxism. Marxism says the government can use force and even murder to force a society to become just. Because the only way everyone has the same income level is if you steal from the rich. And so in a communist system, the government imposes enormous injustice to achieve its justice. The same is with wokeism. We fire people who disagree with us. We create a chill on free speech. All these things happen so that we can eliminate racism. My point, why am I talking about all this in a sermon? Well, listen. My point in raising this is this. In our culture, the problem is not that people aren't moral enough. The problem with our culture is that people are too moral. This is very important for how you and I approach people in our culture. The problem of our time is too much of the wrong justice. The average North American thinks way too much about justice and about a wrong conception of justice. They've twisted justice to make justice all-consuming and the wrong kind. And that's what's creating a lot of our problems today. And too many people in North America today are so sure of their self-defined views of justice that they think they can physically compel other people to believe the same thing that they believe. That's how strongly people feel about these things. So, where's Christianity in all this? Well, Christianity is a very radically different way of viewing things. In Christianity, we assert, by being Christian, that God is the standard and basis of all justice. And that whatever justice we would assert or believe in comes straight from the God who created heaven and earth. And so the Christian's view of justice is not the Christian's view. It's simply explaining what God has revealed. And what has God revealed? Well, Question 9 gets at it. First of all, does not God do man an injustice by requiring in his law what man cannot do? The problem with question 9 is that it's asserting in the idea that God might be unjust. And the entire biblical witness denies such a fact. So number 1, in Christianity, justice is revealed, not us. And we believe what's revealed. Now, what's revealed? Well, let's look at the question in 9. Does God do man an injustice? No. For God so created man that he was able to do it. But man, at the instigation of the devil in deliberate disobedience, robbed himself and all his descendants of these gifts. So, God created man righteous, good. And not just good, it's bigger. Righteousness is God created man to live in the correct, right, holy relationship with himself. What man was created to do, man could do. That's how God created it. Now the question is, A, whose fault is it that man is no longer righteous? And B, what happens to man if he's no longer righteous? Question number 1 is dealt with here in question answer 9. Man, at the instigation of the devil in deliberate disobedience, robbed himself and all his descendants of these gifts. And so man forsook righteousness, denied it, and man decided, I don't need to be righteous, I don't need to live rightly with God, I can spit in God's face, I'll rebel. So the question then is it just for God to punish man for his sin? Now the question is saying, wait a second, now that man sinned, man is not able to become righteous. He's not able to pull himself back and reclaim his righteousness. So how can you require people who have sinned and who can't not sin, how can it be their fault that they sin? The Catechism simply says, because it was man's choice to sin, it is his fault that he sins. That is the revelation of Scripture. Maybe let me explain it this way. let's say, and it's a bit of a weird example, but just bear with me. If we had a child in our house who woke up one day and said, you know what? I'm going to act like a cat or a dog today. This has happened, by the way. I've seen it. If your child said, I'm going to act like a cat or a dog, would you say to your child, you know what? I'm going to change the rules of the household for you. If you don't want to use the toilet, you can use the backyard instead. Would it be our fault as parents for not changing the rules because the child decided to not be a child anymore? No, of course not. The child made the choice. That's a bit of a weird example, but it gets at this question of justice. Is it God's fault for not changing his law to suit the new situation of man? Catechism and the Bible say no. God should not change his standards of justice just because man is now sinful and unable to do it. That is not just. And besides, the idea that man should point the finger at God and think that God should change his standards is enormously egotistical and evidence of sin itself. And the problem with sin it's unjust for us to demand that God change because we changed. Now, you might ask, okay, well, let me apply this a little bit. You might say, well, hold on a second. I'm not answering, I don't ask this question. I don't ask God to change his justice for me. I mean, this must be some sort of, person who questions Christianity and, whatever. But it's in fact not true. We ask this question all the time. This is a very common question that Christians ask. How do they ask it? I'll tell you how. Christians often ask this question when we question why we suffer. Every time I suffer and I don't like it and I question God or I'm angry with God about my suffering, I effectively accuse God of injustice. So my spouse dies. I'm widowed. And for a lot of people, it's an enormous thing. Oh, I lost this person I loved for a long time. It's a huge thing. And one of the stages of grief, so to speak, is sort of denial or bargaining and all these things. And one of those stages is, how dare you, God, do this to me? It's not just, it's not right that you allow this kind of suffering. But when you question God, effectively, you ask this question, and not only that, you take a bite of that fruit and eat it again, because that's what that fruit was. I can make a better justice than God's. If I was in charge, the world would be a better place than now that God's in charge. So this question is enormously practical. And we have to remind ourselves, no, God didn't sin. We did it. The world is broken because of us, not him. And it's not a solution for God to change the rules. That doesn't help. In fact, and I've said this many times in this church, you really, really don't want God to lower his standards of justice, because if he can do that, if he's changeable, that means heaven is changeable. That means the new earth is changeable. That means in the new earth there will be sin. We want God to hate even the tiniest fragment of sin. We want him to destroy sin at every turn so that in heaven there's none of it. We don't want sin in the next life. And the only way that's possible is that the purifying fire of God doesn't relent for a second. So we want God to punish sin. We just don't want him to punish us. That's, of course, Lord's Day 5. We can escape the punishment in Christ, but that's for later. Now, let's finish quickly the next questions. Will God allow such disobedience and apostasy to go unpunished? Certainly not. He's terribly angry with our original sin as well as our actual sins. Therefore, he will punish them by a just judgment both now and eternally. He has declared, Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of law and do them. So God has wrath against sin. We want him to have wrath against sin, and he exercises such wrath. The question is not, should God stop being wrathful? The question is, how do I escape his wrath? We want him to keep the wrath. And God demands that sinners are punished in this life and the next. Now, I don't want to spend so much time on this one. You can ask questions about it. I'll certainly talk about it. There's another, and later on Lord's Day 19, there's a lot of talk about hell and about punishment and these sorts of things. On that time, I'll have a sermon on that, what this wrath is and how it works. Lord's Day 4 is about justice. Is it just for God to punish us? We say yes. Now, number 11, but is God not also merciful? God is indeed merciful, but he is also just. So God's mercy is just and his justice is merciful. Both, they always function together. Neither one ever cancels out the other. His justice requires that sin committed against the most high majesty of God also be punished with the most severe, that is, with everlasting punishment of body and soul. And so the question essentially is, okay, fine, we admit that God can have wrath. Okay, sure. But why doesn't God simply show everyone mercy and absolve them from having to face his wrath? I mean, isn't his nature mercy? How can he also have wrath and mercy? So to a human mind, those things cancel each other out, right? To humans, they go, well, you can't have... A merciful person will never be angry. But that's not who God is. God is just and merciful at the same time. They don't cancel each other out. God is not a bad God or a unloving God because he punishes sin. In fact, how is justice merciful? Justice is merciful because if God punishes evil and evil people, that's the punishment of evil people is mercy on those who are being oppressed by the evil people. His justice ends up creating conditions of mercy and grace for the oppressed. That is why, by the way, Christianity is a giant source of hope and liberation for people who suffer in this world. Nearly every major movement that has successfully overturned a government or stopped it at pernicious evil has been driven by some form of Christianity. That doing mercy requires justice in the end. You can't have one without the other. I mean, it goes same here. If a husband is abusive to his wife or something like that, how do you show mercy to the wife? It's not just by taking her out of the house. It's also by punishing him in prison. We have to maintain that. It's not fun or nice or kind to avoid justice. It's there. So sin must be punished. We want sin to be punished. And the way out is not what we would call... It's not unlimited atonement or the idea that, what's it called again? Oh, I'm missing it. The idea that every person can just be saved. Universal salvation. Thank you, Michael. Thank you. You can always text me if you, universal salvation. And that's kind of what's underneath the question of, is God not also merciful, is the question of universal salvation. Why doesn't God just simply send Jesus to die, to pay God's wrath? And why doesn't he pay God's wrath for everybody? Now, that's a question I'm going to come to in a later Lord's Day again. But God has not ordained that to be the way of things. And his mercy doesn't demand that he save everyone. That's really what's being said in the end. Now, the question that we ought to ask today, and I'll finish with this, is Lord's Day 5. If we're under the wrath of God and God must punish sin, what am I going to do to escape the punishment? How do I do this? It's an extremely pressing question. And by this part of the catechism, this should be the question that's bothering you a ton. The question, you need to be very, very, very sure that whatever way you have of escaping the wrath of God and avoiding it is actually the true way. And just to terrify you for a second, and you need to be terrified on this point, sitting in church is not the way. I hope I don't need to keep saying that. But it's too tempting to think that. You are saved by believing in Jesus Christ alone. And this is where he's preached. Yes, but now your job is to believe it and take it home to hear. And in Jesus, the wrath of God falls on him and not on us. Because we live under him as his body covered in the robes of righteousness. The justice of God does not burn us in hell. But for all of those people that don't want to believe in Jesus, they still sit under the wrath of God. Don't be that. Don't let your neighbors be that. Go to Jesus. That's God's way of giving you mercy. And we need to meditate as people. Why don't more people come to Jesus? It's so obvious. There's a way. Go. Take the way. Instead of questioning God's justice, why don't you believe in Jesus and be okay? That's the part I can never figure out. The sin of man is just too powerful. So when you're talking to people, don't let them question the justice of God. Don't even start that debate. Just say, listen, God has provided you a way out. Why don't you accept the way? Why don't you find Jesus? Why are you so resistant to Jesus? They have no right to question the justice of God. Their version of justice stinks and is awful and is unjust in and of itself. No. Oh, you don't like God's... Okay, no. Have you met Jesus yet? Why don't you believe in Jesus? You would then escape. People don't want to bow to Jesus, that's why. But I'll finish there.